Hi everyone, this is Dr. Eric Hadley again. Today we're talking about Module 10. This is in the section on food, energy, and industrialization. We're talking about the steam engine and the potato. This chapter really deals with two entwined issues. One is energy, the other is food. We've encountered this before, we'll encounter it again. And to some extent the chapter is about a trade-off between gaining energy or gaining food. And we saw this with the Neolithic Revolution, we're seeing it with the Industrial Revolution, and we'll see it again towards the end of the course. The standards chapter really talks about, or starts with talking about, this continuing issue or conundrum that Thomas Malthus had presented, which is that there are limitations on the land for producing food. And when those limitations are reached, the population hits a limit and will eventually go into famine. And so Thomas Malthus really was in some ways a pessimist about the ability of human civilization to adequately provide sufficient nutrition for a population, that eventually the population itself would go into famine just based on iron limits on how much it could produce. Malthus based this on the amount, on really fixed resources. That the amount of land itself was limited, and the amount you could produce on that land was limited. Now you could make changes to the land, different crops, different techniques, different fertilizers to increase the efficiency of the land, but ultimately you'd be limited to that land. And yet, the standage indicates in the 19th century, in one part of the world, Great Britain, they superseded these limits. They managed to break through them. In fact, population in Britain doubled and tripled over the course of the 19th century. So the question becomes, and this is a question that starts with industrialization, it's a question that remains an issue today as population growth seems to continue unabated. How far can population go before the amount of food that the land can produce catches up? Standage indicates that in this particular case, industrialization, the process of industrializing over the course of the 19th century, was really central to understanding how Great Britain was able to produce so many people. You see he identifies three major reasons why this is the case. First would be what I just alluded to, which is a surplus in production. And that's achieved through new crops, things like turnips and clover, to rejuvenate the land, eventually fertilizer, to use the land, and then things like the seed drill, Jethro Tull's seed drill, and others to make more effective use of the land itself. And that allows for less people to work more land, and that means that you could free up more people to do something else if you had sufficient food for them. And this frees up workers, and these workers eventually go to factories and start working in something other than agriculture. The second thing he recognizes is coal mining. And coal mining, you might initially say, well, how is that related to food production? Standage indicates that there's a couple reasons. First, these workers now have a new energy source to use in the factories, a much more efficient energy source than what they had before, in the use of coal-fired steam engines to turn machinery, which allows for manufacturing. But also as an energy source, the energy source that had been used all the way back to prehistoric times was wood to heat homes, to cook food. And if you could use coal, which burns hotter with less of it, then you could free up forest land to do something else with it. And that's exactly what happens in Britain. It's an early form of deforestation. Large sections of Britain, millions of acres that were once held as forest for the purpose of sustainable firewood, are no longer needed. And so they're able to actually open up land because of coal mining. Third, this relates to the previous two. If you have workers and you have factories powered with coal, then you can make goods, and finished trade goods, and you can trade these goods worldwide for more food if you need it. And that's more or less what Britain did. So let's talk about industrialization. Coal mining took off rather quickly in the 19th century in Britain. By 1800 alone, 10 million tons of coal was being mined. This is used to power steam engines. Newcomen and James Watt both create steam engines. I have pictures of James Watt's steam engine. Steam engine allows for a constant power source, fueled as long as you can continue to heat and condense water to create steam to power the engine itself. So you see the use of these engines near a water source and often near a coal mine, places up in the Midlands and northern areas of Britain, from Edinburgh and Glasgow over to Liverpool and Birmingham in particular. And it allows them to create factories, to industrialize things like textile production using things like a spinning jenny. So the workers themselves become more or less machine workers. So they're not valued for their skills anymore. They're valued for their labor, and their labor is pretty rough, and it's not high skilled labor, which in a sense turns people into what I've noted here, a working class or proletariat. They're paid for their time. They lose the means of production that they once had in things like guilds or in an artisanal shop in a city. Now, these large factories require a lot of capital. They require a lot of money. Rich people have to be able to create them. They're fixed assets, which mean people have to go to the asset to work it. You see relatively poor working conditions in these factories. Look through some of my slides here. You can see this in an average worker in the early 19th century. There's a steam engine behind him. You also see the use of iron replacing stone and wood as a means for construction. The world's first iron bridge appears in Britain in the 18th century. Alongside that, you have widespread urbanization. These factories tend to be located near or in cities. People have to live there in order to work in the factory. By 1850, half of Great Britain is urbanized. You have over 2 million people in London alone. That's a doubling of population in half a century, with other urban areas to follow on the continent, places like Berlin, Paris, or Brussels. 1 million people in Paris. It had also doubled. These are, when these people move in, there's no real means by which they don't plan for them. And so it's overcrowded. Disease becomes an issue. Infrastructure is an issue. You have raw sewage in the streets, no easy access to heat or clean water. You begin to see widespread sickness and disease in these close conditions and impoverished conditions. Cholera epidemics are really tied to industrialization. Tuberculosis, influenza, dysentery are also become these problems in these new urban ghettos, really, of workers. So there's a trade-off in that as well, quality of life, in a sense, for what these workers once were. Their grandparents were farmers, and now they live in cities, and they really don't have any control over what they do. They more or less work for their time. Because so many people are working in cities, they're no longer tied to the land, and so Britain has to begin importing its food. By the 1840s, about 1/6 of its food came from Ireland. Now, Ireland is largely a Catholic, Celtic country, an island right next to Great Britain, and it had been colonized by the English in particular, starting in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. By the 18th century, most of what is of Ireland today is dominated by Protestant English or Scottish landlords, and they've more or less turned Ireland into an agricultural colony. And by the 19th century, they really need this agriculture to replace what they've lost in Britain. Even with the surplus of land freed up by coal mining and improved techniques, the population increase in Great Britain is so significant that they need additional food sources. In Ireland, very close, it's considered part of Great Britain at this time, is the easiest place to do that. So they actually begin large-scale wheat production in Ireland using these native Irish workers. And the workers themselves aren't really given the wheat. The wheat has to go to England. And so they are expected to work the land. In return, they get a small portion of it to grow potatoes on, a different crop that's in some ways much more efficient. You can get a lot more potatoes out of an acre of land than you can of wheat. And so over time, the potato becomes this vehicle for sustenance for the Irish population, an impoverished, largely Catholic Irish population. They don't own their own land, they're renters, they live and subsist off potatoes, while at the same time many of them work fields for land or for grain production that essentially is an export, particularly in the east and the north. So looking at this slide, we see that potato becomes more or less a staple crop for Catholic Ireland. It's a very large population, much larger than it should be by the 1840s. Ireland, in this, I think I mentioned this in the last module, went from about 500,000 or 1 million in the 17th century to 8 million within 200 years, largely because of the potato in the 18th century. Potatoes are really efficient for a number of reasons, most notably in the amount of nutrients a potato has, and the amount of potatoes you can grow in an acre makes it really conducive to something like potato farming in Ireland. But there are problems with potatoes as well, particularly in their storage. As you may know, as people who live in Idaho, potatoes really only can be stored effectively for about 1 year, whereas something like grain or corn or even rice, if it's dry and protected from mice or other parasites, it can be preserved for years at a time. And so, but potatoes don't have that longevity. So storage is an issue, and they can also be vulnerable to things like a fungal infection. And that's exactly what sets in the fall of 1845. You see in 1845 a partial potato failure, a fungal blight that caused the potato plants and the potatoes themselves to rot in the fields. And they had reserves which carried them over through 1846, but in 1846 their crop failed again, and famine sets in. There are no more reserves to be drawn upon. And this leads to the year of so-called Black 47, when there is no food, when people are starving in large numbers across Ireland. They find bodies with green mouths from eating grass. And this was a terrible, terrible year. In all, between 1846 really and 1848 or 49, about 1 million Irish die, and another 1.5 million leave. And this is a huge demographic crisis, and Britain, who has claimed Ireland, has to deal with it. The Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, in 1845, doesn't really recognize the gravity of the issue. It's not until 1846 that he starts dealing with it. And what the underlying issue here is, and you can I'll go to the next slide and come back, it's a law in Britain that is a tariff law, meaning that landowners in England, in order to keep their rents high and bread prices high, put a tariff on any foreign grain, i.e. not Irish, not British, not Scottish, but foreign, like American or from the European continent. Any grain, which they called corn, entering Great Britain had a large tariff on it. And for many years, particularly after industrialization had set in, the industrialists were opposed to these tariffs. They wanted to repeal these corn laws. They saw that if cheap foreign grain came into Britain, it would be a good thing for their workers. They wouldn't have to pay as much to their workers as well if the price of bread dropped. And so it becomes kind of a debate between two groups of elites, an old elite of agrarian landowners, particularly in England, and a new elite of industrialists who depend on these workers and want them to be fed. And kind of in the midst of this debate, the Irish potato famine happens. And Sir Robert Peel is forced to take this up. in the 1840s. Now he's a Tory or a conservative. The Tories are these landowners that want to keep this corn law in force. But eventually Peel recognizes that if he does nothing, if he doesn't allow any new grain to come in, that the problem in Ireland will get much, much worse. And so because of the Irish famine, he ultimately forces Parliament, including his own party, to vote to repeal the Corn Laws. And once the Corn Laws are repealed, that allows for the importation of actual corn, not wheat, but real corn, American corn, into Ireland as a mechanism for trying to assist the impoverished, starving Irish. This also leads to the fall of Peel's government. He'll be replaced by the opposition party under Lord John Russell. Russell will use an old Tudor law dating back to the 1600s of the Poor Law. He'll set up poorhouses. You have to go to the poorhouse. You have to work in order to get food. You have to be of a sufficient impoverished class, meaning you can't have a home. So it actually increases the amount of poverty because people are forced to give up what they have in order to prove that they need assistance. And the work that they do is really meaningless, building roads to nowhere. And so the British government eventually takes on direct famine relief, but by this time hundreds of thousands of people have died or left, and it's really too little, too late. And there's a kind of another insidious part of this, which is that throughout the famine, throughout those 5 years in the 1840s, from 1845 to about 1850, grain continued to be exported from Ireland into Britain. And so they didn't even stop the transport of grain out of Ireland itself so that that could feed the local population. This is an anti-Corn Law League meeting showing kind of popularity of the working class to getting rid of the Corn Laws in Britain, and then the Irish famine itself. These are drawings done, contemporary drawings done in 1847 of Irish peasants searching the ground for food. This shows from around 1700 all the way up to the present day, the population of Ireland in comparison to the population of Europe. The green is, of course it's green, it's Ireland. If you look around 1840s, you can see the height of the population stretching between over 8 million really. And if you look today, Ireland's population is barely 5.5 million. And so it has never really recovered in terms of population from the famine. And this map shows you where the population decline was most significant. And you can see that it's mostly in the Catholic areas of Ireland, in Western and Southern Ireland in particular. In the northern Protestant areas, in Ulster, which is this area up here, it's mitigated to some extent. Here's major cities of Belfast, Dublin, and Cork, where there are actually more people. But across Ireland, you see widespread population decline. This is in Dublin today, a memorial to the victims of the famine. So much of Western Ireland, if you go to Ireland today and drive into Western Ireland through here in Connemara, and you go into the countryside, you find hundreds, if not thousands, of ruined stone homes that were once filled with Irish farmers, potato farmers, that have either died or left in the 1840s. Here is a Catholic memorial in Catholic West Belfast, Northern Ireland, which is a pretty pointed critique of Britain. It describes the potato famine as in fact genocide. It exaggerates the deaths, and I think you could debate whether or not Britain intended this to happen. The last point that Standage really brings up is this issue of energy revolutions, and through looking at the Industrial Revolution, looking at the famine itself, and looking at the development of an English working class and this issue over tariffs and trade and energy use and coal, Standage brings up this kind of parallel revolutions, going back to the very first week of this class, this Neolithic revolution, comparing it to what this is, an industrial revolution. And he notes a few similarities that these are really like watershed moments in human history, both of them. They both, there's a number of reasons they transform human life. In the Neolithic agricultural revolution, people settle down, they begin farming. They're using really solar radiation and water to as energy to create food, and this changes the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Um, and so there's a fundamental transformation of how humans then organize themselves into cities, and then eventually in medieval Europe and into feudal manorial culture or Aztec culture with its tribute, imperial China. And so you see in all of those were more or less reflections of agricultural production, whether it was rice or wheat or corn. These large-scale civilizations emerge using peasants as a means by which to create a food surplus for elites. We've gone over this before in this class. You can also see the question of the better off argument. In this case, is workers are moved from their traditional place in rural areas, and they become factory workers, and they no longer, as I said, can really control their own time or their own machinery or their own skill set, and they settle into these relatively impoverished, really difficult living conditions. That you could make the similar argument that you see with the hunter-gatherers, that in some ways this revolution, in the short term at least, made people worse off, most people at least worse off. You also have this issue of environmental effects. Wide-scale agricultural development across Europe and Africa and Asia and the Americas led to things like deforestation. It led to single-crop diets. It had an environmental impact that hunter-gatherer life really didn't have on the natural world, and that's exacerbated multifold for the Industrial Revolution. There are widespread environmental impacts, and they're debated still today. The burning of coal releases carbon. It's indisputable that in a fossil fuel, you're burning off energy that's been stored in the ground for millions of years, and that carbon has been stored for millions of years. If you burn wood today, that wood has been based on plant carbon life that has absorbed carbon out of the atmosphere very recently. And so it's kind of a symbiotic system where as it absorbs carbon and then releases carbon within a couple generations at most, as opposed to storing millions of years of carbon underground and then releasing it almost simultaneously. And that can lead to serious environmental impacts. So you have this exchanging of crisis. You're exchanging, you're gaining something out of this. You're gaining food security to some extent and energy security, but you're also trading off things like carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and pollution as well. Sandage then turns into this issue of really directly in modern life of trading food for fuel. He looks at things like the ethanol industry. Ethanol is really a fuel based off of corn fermentation, and he indicates how it's relatively, with using American corn, it's relatively low sugar, and so the energy trade-off is pretty minimal. You have a net gain, but the net gain is relatively small, and the amount of carbon dioxide reduction is actually pretty limited, something like 12 or 13%. Whereas if you look at other crops that could be used, something like sugar, or to make a sugar-based ethanol like they use in Brazil, or you use a different crop to make a diesel fuel, like an oil, where you're extracting oil out of it rather than making an ethanol, like they do. He mentions biodiesel in Germany. Both are much more efficient uses. But in all three of these cases, whether it's sugar or biodiesel based off soy or corn or corn oil, or if you're making ethanol directly from corn, in a sense you're exchanging the amount of food that you can produce for energy, and that makes farmers have to make a choice when they grow a crop, what crop to grow. There are many crops that are more nutritious often than corn is, and if you're growing corn and then not even feeding people with it, but you're using it to fuel a tank, what's the trade-off? And the Malthusian limits, I think, is what he's saying, are slowly creeping back into the picture as the human population increases and increases and increases. Eventually we're going to hit those limits again when we can no longer sustain the energy production to meet the demands on food production. And ultimately, that does come down to a question of land. So that's something I think we're going to explore further. This kind of gets us up through the mid 19th century, late 19th century, and so we're going to move on in history into more recent times. So that's what I have to say for this lecture, and thank you all very much.